Hello, everyone. So I'm going to do a quick recording of my panel talk from this most recent Open Data Science conference that took place in Boston on May 13th and 14th. A few of you have asked me for the PowerPoint and or a recording, so I'm going to give you a recording. The topic was Know Better, Do Better. So we discussed bridging data literacy and responsible AI. And for those who do not know me, I go by Jelly Spratley, government name Angelica, and I'm currently a manager of academic data at KIPP North Carolina, as well as a senior technical curriculum developer slash instructional designer for the Marcy Lab School based out of Brooklyn. So I was on a panel of three other awesome women as we did crash talks on different topics. So let's go ahead and get into the talk. So I want you to read what's on the screen here. This was like a quick survey to kind of rate yourself of how often do you ask, what story is in the data that I'm seeing? Where did this data come from and is it credible? What's the quality of that data? And most importantly, how does the use of this data impact the person, people in society? And you can score yourself 0 to 3 points. A perfect score would be 12 points. So if you didn't get a perfect score on this, there's still room for improvement. So, how can we improve our data literacy, which in turn can improve the AI algorithms out here? So, we started off with just defining what data literacy is. There's tons of definitions of data literacy, but it's the ability to pretty much analyze and communicate using data. So, understanding the basic statistics, asking the right questions about your data, especially how can this data impact people? Is the right message being conveyed with this data? Are there any misleading information or visuals coming through this data? And understanding the people behind the data points. Because 9 times out of 10, the data that you're working with has some type of people involvement, either directly or indirectly. And of course, here's a nice little statistics here that only 24% of business decision makers consider themselves data literate. And this is a stat by Click and Accenture. And why does data literacy matters? Data literacy matters because data literate employees are 3 times more likely to say that they're performing very well at work. And you can read the rest of the statistics on the screen. I personally have seen organizations, especially organizations that I work for, that once people understand where to get data, what data metrics their department is shooting for, and they start communicating these metrics through departmental meetings and presentations, people become more aware and they start making data driven decisions and not just going off of that gut instinct. And it also lets them see things from a more creative and innovative lens. So what's the link between data and AI? And you probably have heard this whole saying garbage in, garbage out. I rephrased it in my talk as in harmful data going in will lead to harmful broken AI. And it's very similar if you have bad ingredients like sugar with roaches or rancid butter or eggs that have spoiled and you still try to make a cookie, that cookie is still going to come out broken. So AI is trained on data. And if we don't understand the data, we don't understand AI and we can't build ethical AI. So we need to understand how it was collected and labeled. And bias, fairness, and accountability starts with the data. And here's an example here that we hear a lot in the field about a recruitment AI trained on biased historical data can reinforce discrimination. So if your historical data is going back 20, 30, 40, 50, sometimes even 10 years, and that historical data has denied underrepresented applicants, and you're still using that historical data to train your tools today, you are perpetuating that historical discrimination. So you want to make sure that you actually know what's in your data, what bias exists in your data, even historical data that you are still using. And this marries with the next slide about historical bias as well as machine bias and selection bias. There's over 120 different biases out here, so I cannot cover them all. But data literacy also includes recognizing that bias in the data store. So, not just understanding the data that is presented to you, but really critically challenging that data, having healthy skepticism about where that data came from and is there bias in how it was collected? Was there ethical practices that were not intact before they collected the data, etc. So, data literacy programs should also include how bias will show up in the data set, whether it's exclusion, labeling, the sampling practices. And like I said, if there's historical data that has past inequities in it still being utilized. So, the risk of low data literacy in AI, all in all, failing to ask who is impacted. And if you're not asking throughout the whole entire algorithmic process, how will society be impacted by this decision? You are failing that AI algorithm and more importantly, failing society. So what can happen when data literacy is absent? So this is a situation that had a lot of media coverage about installing these facial recognition systems outside of Brooklyn apartments. Tenants weren't informed. They felt like this algorithm was really targeting them, really leading to gentrification. And they had a lot of legal complaints and a lot of media backlash and erosion of trust ultimately. And so ethical failure starts with poor data literacy and the lack of this human centered thinking. We're not keeping people at the center, and people should always be at the center. And when one company has this type of backlash, the rest of the people in the industry feels it, right? So if we want to get people to trust us and trust these algorithms, we have to start talking about the person and societal impact of the algorithm. And so when we're bridging this gap between data and AI models or AI algorithms, there's this concept of stale data, right? Stale data, data not intended for modeling. An example, you're taking a whole bunch of HR notes and you're trying to model those HR notes. That might not be the best thing to do, as well as I've mentioned before, that historical data that reinforces these outdated societal norms. And stale data in turn leads to low accuracy, irrelevant decision, and what we call model drift. And this concept of model drift is when your model changes its outcome and reduce accuracy or fairness over time. So you may launch a model in day one, 98% accurate across all demographic groups. And then you check on it a week, a month, years from now, and it starts to drift drastically. Now it's 70, 60, 50, 40% accurate. And there's different types of model drift. Fairness drift is when the model disproportionately harms certain groups over time. So we want to make sure that we monitor our models once we put them in deployment for things like fairness drift, accuracy drift, concept drift, etc. So, what to focus on when you're actually developing these AI tools and models? So, we said focus a lot on that data, challenging the data source. Is the data stale? Are we using historical data that has societal inequities in it from previous points in history, etc.? But as always, we want to focus on these metrics. And these are very common metrics for those who have been in data for a minute. I know when I was trained in data science and analytics, we talked about fairness, accountability, transparency, and inclusivity, or FATI or FAIT, better yet. And fairness can have 21 different definitions, and it's all about your use case. So, what is fair for this algorithm may not be fair for another algorithm. So, keep that in mind. How transparent are we being from the get go? Me and one of my best friends were talking about how a certain AI model that is current only allows you to choose avatars of white women and they don't have any black women avatars. Now, besides being upfront saying, hey, this may be a beta, or we decided to include this skin tone first, whatever the case may be, they weren't transparent about their tool and they still wanted us to buy that tool. So think about how you can include the groups that will be impacted and how you yourself are going to take accountability of your model's performance. And then we talked about this bridge between the MEP and MVP. If you're in software engineering or in data, you have heard of the minimum viable product, even if you're not in data, right? What is the minimum product that we need to have in place in order to kind of pass it along, right? But if we're thinking about MVPs, we're thinking about being the first to market, to ship it out fast. We're thinking more about speed when we should also be thinking about minimum ethical products, MEPs, where you need to launch this data responsibly. And how are we validating the impacts at every stage of development to minimize societal harm and also to enhance safety? And one way is about doing those metric checks, but also doing an impact review. How will this model impact the end users? Doing bias checks throughout, testing accessibility, etc. So regular audits plus human oversight can help this. And a lot of people have talked about how can we have human in the loop? This is a way to have human in the loop to make sure that you're delivering ethical products. Consequence scanning is also something that is great to do with your algorithms. And you can either act, influence, or monitor. Think of it as aim. So you can act on if clear harm is being done. So a lot of our AI algorithms can impact who gets access to services. So there was the whole premise about during COVID, an algorithm has to determine who gets access to ventilators. And no old people got access to ventilators based off of this algorithm. So you're denying a certain demographic services or access to things, whether it's access to a mortgage, access to credit cards, etc. And those are things that you need to act on from the get-go. Things that you need to monitor, just like if a model is reacting oddly to some new trends, right? The model could be unpredictable because it wasn't really trained on this new trend. It was trained on historical data. So you need to really monitor that. You can't just set it and forget it. So keep in mind that tech is never neutral and ignoring consequences is a choice. So think about consequence scanning, put that as a piece in your project management puzzles, consequence scanning throughout, and who's going to own that. And make sure there's multiple diverse people owning that. All right, Jelly, all of this sounds good, but how can I get started with actually increasing this data literacy and in turn, this data literacy feeding into responsible AI? And start by building a data literate culture. This takes time. This is not overnight. For some companies, this could take 6 months. Others, it could take more of a year. Okay. And so you have to get people buy-in. What do they care about in the certain role that they're in? Normalize asking questions about data and models. So in your stand-ups, in departmental meetings, go back to what is the data in the strategic plan that we're looking at? Is it more customers that we're acquiring? Is it low turnover? Whatever the North Star metrics and KPIs are, and how am I consistently talking about these data metrics in my data meetings, in my departmental meetings, excuse me, in stand-ups? Provide training on data basics for all employees, no matter where they sit at. And this is all about differentiation of instruction, figuring out, okay, this is a good training program where the employees can kind of choose their own path based off of their literacy level now, get their baseline, and how that can improve their personal job. People are more likely to buy in if they understand how it impacts them. And encourage transparency and documentation. There should be no AI algorithm or process or model algorithm or process in general in your organization that does not have documentation. And within that documentation, how does this process impact the end user? Whether it's an internal end user, external end user, etc. We need to document these things so when it's time to launch, we can speak to things like transparency, inclusivity, accountability, etc. And data literacy, in fact, is for everyone. You hear this over and over again. It's about that differentiation where people can actually feel that data literacy is important for their current role. So, as a leader, you should always ask about fairness metrics and dashboards and require documentation and AI review. So, if you know that you are a project leader and you are not necessarily technical, your technical team require they have a documentation process, require that they look at these fairness metrics and they're not just focused on the MVP versus the MEP. For non-data employees, join those lunch and learn sessions, and companies offer them. Learn to challenge data assumptions with curiosity. I presented you tons of statistics in the beginning of this deck, but you should challenge those statistics, all right? Like, what was the time frame of this statistic? 3 times more likely to be innovative? Is that only in certain industries? When was this study done and how many people were in the study? Learn how to challenge data assumptions and have that curious mindset. And for data teams, have the most responsibility to evaluate models for drift and bias throughout and document limitations and be transparent about those limitations and assumptions. And this way, we can create this shared responsibility of data literacy across an entire organization. And you can do it on a budget. People who know me know I love to coupon. So if it's free 99, it's for me. So almost a $0 budget. Add data chats to existing meetings. Just put people in breakout rooms and say, hey, this is the metric that we're focused on. This is the data that we presented to you about revenue across time. Go into a breakout room and discuss what do you feel about the data we just presented. Is there anything that you want to challenge that? Share case studies, especially within your organization, about what went right and what went wrong. That is part of transparency. Things that are low budget, get your software engineering team or IT team or whoever to spin up a sandbox so people can practice on open data sets, saying, hey, you all have access to this sandbox to make your own dashboards or drag and drop things to actually look at some data. And there's also peer-led workshops where you guys can work on internal projects or external ones. Data for good is always good to actually give back. You can actually have a leaderboard, present challenges to your organization. And things that are a little bit more mid-tier and higher budget is partnering with those corporate instructional designers for that differentiation of training, including me, and audit those workflows. Get an outside consultant to look at your current AI workflow and making sure that you're checking for these bias and fairness metrics, etc. And specifically for the people, every data project that you start off with, ask, is the data ethical and up to date? Right? Add a fairness check and encourage teams to ask more human-centered questions and have diverse people on your team. And with that said, that was the talk in a nutshell. Thank you all who came in person to the talk. Thank you all who are actually listening to this recording as well. I'm posting this on LinkedIn, so I'm sure those who have access to it have access to LinkedIn. And don't forget that I also have a t-shirt shop called Jelly's Geeky Goods that has data and responsible AI shirts on there as well. Thank you so, so, so much, and you all have a great day.